A bobcat, days overdue to give birth, refuses to nest, leaving her rescuers baffled. But when the vet finally checks the ultrasound, what she sees makes her scream in shock. A hidden danger threatens not just the bobcat's life, but her unborn kittens as well. What's lurking beneath the surface? And will they find a way to save this fragile family before it's too late? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. Miguel stood at the front desk of the local animal shelter, his hands steady as he signed the last of the adoption papers. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the worn linoleum floor. 5 golden retrievers huddled together nearby, their clouded eyes staring into nothing. Their golden coats were dull and matted in places, showing signs of neglect. The shelter worker, a middle-aged woman with graying hair pulled back in a tight bun, handed him the leashes with hesitation in her movements. Her name tag read Sandra, and worry lines creased her forehead. "Are you absolutely sure about this, Mr. Sanchez?" she asked, her voice tinged with both concern and doubt. Miguel took the leashes, his fingers wrapping firmly around the worn leather. The familiar scent of dog food and disinfectant filled his nostrils. "Yes, I am," he replied softly, but with conviction. The dogs shifted uncertainly, bumping into each other as they tried to make sense of their surroundings. Their tails wagged half-heartedly, unsure of what was happening. Their ears perked up at every small sound, compensating for their lack of sight. Miguel knelt beside them, his movements slow and deliberate. One by one, he touched each dog, letting them smell his hand and get used to his presence. "Hey there," he whispered, running his fingers through their golden fur. A few tangles caught at his fingers, but he worked through them gently. "I'm Miguel. You're coming home with me today." His voice was gentle, almost musical. "I promise I'll take good care of you all." The shelter worker watched the scene unfold, shaking her head slightly. She fiddled with a pen on her desk, clicking it nervously. "Not many would take on such a challenge," she remarked, her tone somewhere between admiration and pity. Miguel looked up at her, his eyes filled with determination. The fluorescent light caught the flecks of gray in his dark hair. "They deserve a chance," he said simply. Outside the shelter, the afternoon sun beat down on the quiet street as Miguel carefully guided his new family toward home. The dogs moved cautiously, their paws testing each step. Some walked too fast, others too slow, creating a tangled mess of leashes and confused canines. The concrete sidewalk radiated heat beneath their paws. Neighbors stopped to stare. 2 women in workout clothes paused their conversation, watching the unusual procession with raised eyebrows and poorly concealed whispers. A man walking his own dog crossed to the other side of the street, as if blindness might be contagious. His healthy Labrador strained at the leash, curious about the new dogs. Elise Carter, wearing a light summer dress patterned with small flowers, slowed her pace as she passed by. Her face softened with concern as she watched Miguel struggling to keep the dogs in formation. But she kept walking, her shoes clicking against the sidewalk. She clutched her grocery bags tighter, as if wanting to help but unsure how. Nearby, Lucas Miller leaned against a white picket fence, his teenage face twisted in a smirk. His backpack hung carelessly from one shoulder. "Blind leading the blind," he muttered, just loud enough to be heard. A couple of his friends snickered behind him. From his well-maintained porch across the street, Brian Davis stood with his arms crossed, his expression darkening as he watched Miguel and the dogs make their slow progress. His disapproval was clear in the tight line of his mouth, though he remained silent. The morning paper lay forgotten at his feet. Miguel felt the weight of their stares, heard the whispers and muffled laughter, but kept his head high. His jaw tightened slightly, the only sign of his awareness of their judgment. Sweat began to bead on his forehead in the afternoon heat. Finally reaching his small rental house with its peeling paint and overgrown lawn, Miguel guided the dogs inside. In his modest living room, he carefully arranged soft blankets in a corner, creating makeshift beds. He filled water bowls and placed them where the dogs could easily find them, making sure to space them evenly. The golden retrievers stayed close together, their shoulders touching as they explored their new space with tentative steps. Their nails clicked softly on the hardwood floors as they moved about uncertainly. Outside, the sound of neighbors' laughter drifted through the windows. Miguel walked to the windows and drew the curtains closed, blocking out the curious onlookers. Leaning against the wall, he took a deep breath, his shoulders rising and falling slowly. In the dim light of his living room, surrounded by his new charges, he straightened his spine, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The dog's gentle breathing filled the quiet space, a reminder of why he'd chosen this path. The first rays of sunlight crept through Miguel's curtains when he heard the sound of bumping furniture and soft whimpers. He opened his eyes to find his new family of golden retrievers stumbling around the living room, their paws sliding on the unfamiliar hardwood floor, tails swishing uncertainly in the dim morning light. One of the dogs knocked into the coffee table, causing a frightened yelp that set off a chain reaction of nervous barking. The sound echoed through the small house as they bumped into each other, disoriented. Miguel quickly got up from his makeshift bed on the couch and moved toward them, his heart aching at their confusion. "It's okay. It's okay," he said softly, reaching for the treats he'd placed on the side table the night before. The familiar rustle of the treat bag made their ears perk up, their noses lifting to catch the scent, heads turning with newfound interest. Miguel knelt down, letting each dog find their way to him by following his voice and the smell of treats. As they gathered around, he gently stroked their soft fur, noting their individual characteristics, the way one wagged her tail more enthusiastically than the others, how another kept pressing against his leg for more attention, the gentle breathing of each dog as they settled around him. "You need names," he whispered, studying their faces in the growing morning light. "Names that remind us what we're fighting for." He touched the first dog's head, the one who'd shown the most courage in exploring the new space, running his fingers through the golden fur. "Valor," he said firmly. The gentle female who kept nuzzling his hand became Grace, her touch as soft as her new name suggested. The enthusiastic tail wagger, Joy, lived up to her name with each happy movement. The quiet, steady one, who stayed close to his side, became Faith, her loyalty already evident. And the last one, who, despite her blindness, kept trying to comfort the others with gentle nudges and soft whimpers, he named Hope. Later that morning, Miguel guided his newly named family onto the front porch, speaking quietly to each dog as they moved. The cool morning air carried the scent of freshly cut grass as he helped them navigate the small steps, his hands steady and patient with each uncertain paw. Elise Carter approached slowly, her curiosity evident in her careful steps and worried expression. She watched as Miguel patiently guided each dog, her head tilted slightly, hands clasped together. "Do you think you can handle this?" she asked, her voice gentle but uncertain, concern written across her face. Miguel looked up, meeting her gaze with quiet confidence. He nodded, still keeping his hand steady on Hope's back as she explored the porch, her nose working overtime to map her new surroundings. From across the street came Brian Davis' sharp voice, cutting through the morning quiet like a knife. "That's a lot of trouble for a few useless animals," he called out, his words dripping with sarcasm as he stood in his perfectly manicured yard. Miguel continued guiding Faith down the last step, his voice calm but firm as he replied, They're not useless. They just need someone to believe in them. His words carried clearly across the morning air, steady and sure. The morning progressed as Miguel led his pack down the sidewalk, their leashes carefully arranged to prevent tangling. They moved slowly, but with growing confidence in their steps, each dog learning to trust Miguel's gentle guidance and verbal cues. Lucas Miller stood at the corner, his teenage frame leaning against a stop sign, arms crossed over his chest. As Miguel and the dogs approached, he let out a derisive laugh. "What a spectacle," he called out, loud enough for everyone to hear, his voice carrying the edge of teenage mockery. Nearby neighbors paused their morning routines to watch, some hiding their giggles behind their hands, others whispering to each other and pointing at the unusual parade. Miguel kept his eyes forward, his face composed as he focused on guiding his dogs through their morning walk, letting the mockery roll past him like water off a duck's back. His determination showed in every step, in every gentle word he spoke to his new family. Inside his workshop, Miguel spread the graph paper across his workbench, carefully sketching out designs for ramps and feeding stations. Sawdust danced in the morning light that filtered through the shed's small window, creating golden specks in the air. Hope and Grace lay at his feet, their soft breathing a steady rhythm, while the other three dogs, Valor, Joy, and Faith, explored the workshop's perimeter, their noses leading the way as they bumped gently against familiar tools and wood scraps. "Let's see," Miguel muttered, measuring a piece of plywood with weathered hands. "A gentle slope here, maybe some guide rails." He made careful notes, wanting everything to be perfect for his furry family. The sound of his pencil scratching against paper mixed with the gentle thump of wagging tails against the floor and the occasional snuffle from an investigating nose. At the general store, Miguel pushed his cart down the hardware aisle, checking his list. Wood, screws, rubber matting for traction. His fingers traced each item as he read. The familiar bell above the door chimed as Elise Carter walked in, her face brightening when she spotted him, heading straight toward him with purpose in her steps and a newspaper clutched in her hand. "Miguel," she said warmly, "I've been thinking about your dogs. There's this organization, Paws Without Limits. They help people with disabled pets. They might have some good ideas. I read about them just this morning." Before Miguel could respond, Brian Davis's voice cut through the air from the next aisle, sharp and cold. "What a waste of time," he sneered, peering around the corner with narrowed eyes. 5 blind dogs? You're throwing good money after bad. Should have left them where you found them." Miguel noticed Lucas Miller in his peripheral vision, stuffing candy bars into his jacket pockets before slipping out the front door, shoulders hunched and head down. But Miguel's focus remained on his task. These supplies would help make his dogs' lives better, and that's what mattered most. Back in his yard, Miguel wiped sweat from his forehead as he positioned the first ramp against the back steps, making sure it was secure and steady. The dogs circled around, their noses working overtime to understand this new addition to their environment, tails swishing with curiosity. Faith approached first, her paw touching the edge of the ramp tentatively as her whiskers twitched. She took one step up, then another, but on the third step, she lost her balance and tumbled sideways with a startled yelp. Miguel was there instantly, his hands gentle as he helped her up, checking for any scrapes or bruises. "It's okay, girl," he soothed, stroking her fur and scratching behind her ears. "We'll try again. We've got all the time in the world." Faith's tail wagged at the sound of his voice, her trust unwavering as she nuzzled his hand, ready to make another attempt. The other dogs gathered closer, drawn by the commotion, their presence a reminder of why every effort was worthwhile. In his dimly lit living room, Miguel sat cross-legged on the floor, a small silver bell in his hand. The setting sun cast long shadows through the windows, creating a peaceful atmosphere. He gently rang the bell, watching as Hope's ears perked up. "That's it, girl," he whispered, offering a treat when she took a tentative step toward the sound. One by one, he worked with each dog, using different sounds. A soft tap on the floor, a gentle whistle, the quiet jingle of the bell. Grace was the first to walk confidently toward his voice. Faith followed soon after, her tail wagging slightly. Even timid Joy managed to navigate around a chair cushion when Miguel called. Valor remained hesitant, but showed interest, his head tilting at each new sound. For the first time since bringing them home, Miguel felt his lips curve into a genuine smile. The dogs were learning. They were trying. Outside Elise's house, the afternoon air grew heavy with tension. "You never listen," her husband's voice boomed from inside, making her flinch as she watered her flower beds. Brian Davis strolled past, his expensive loafers clicking against the sidewalk. "The dog man will never make it," he announced loudly, clearly wanting Elise to hear. "5 blind dogs, he'll give up within a month." Elise's shoulders slumped, but she remained silent, focusing on her petunias. Lucas Miller shuffled past, hands stuffed in his pockets, his eyes darting between Brian's retreating figure and Elise's tense posture. The teenager's face showed confusion and discomfort, but he kept walking. Later that night, Miguel sat at his small kitchen table, eating a simple dinner of rice and beans. The kitchen was quiet, except for the soft padding of paws on the linoleum floor. Hope rested her head on his knee, while Faith and Grace leaned against his legs. Joy and Valor lay nearby, their breathing steady and calm. Miguel reached down to scratch behind Hope's ears. "We'll prove them all wrong," he whispered into the peaceful darkness, the dog's presence providing a comfort he hadn't expected to find. The small-town library's door creaked as Miguel stepped inside, the familiar scent of old books filling the air. Dust motes danced in the sunbeams streaming through tall windows. He spotted Elise Carter behind the front desk, arranging returned books. "Excuse me," Miguel said softly, approaching the desk. "I'm looking for books about training blind dogs." Elise looked up, surprise flickering across her face. "Oh, Miguel. Yes, let me help you with that." She stepped around the desk, her sensible shoes quiet on the worn carpet. "I've been thinking about your dogs, actually." They walked together through the narrow aisles, Elise running her fingers along book spines. "Here's one about service animals," she said, pulling out a worn hardcover. "And this one," she reached higher, grabbing another book. "It's about working with disabled pets." Miguel accepted the books gratefully. "Thank you. I need to learn everything I can." "You're really serious about this, aren't you?" Elise's voice was soft, tinged with admiration. Miguel nodded, a small smile crossing his face. "They deserve nothing less." Outside the library, the afternoon sun was harsh after the building's dim interior. Miguel clutched his small stack of books when he nearly collided with Lucas Miller lounging against the wall. Lucas straightened up, scuffing his shoe against the sidewalk. "Why do you even bother with those dogs?" he asked, his tone less hostile than usual, almost curious. Miguel adjusted his grip on the books. "They need me as much as I need them." "What's that supposed to mean?" Lucas asked, shifting uncomfortably. Miguel started to respond, but Lucas was already turning away, shoulders hunched as he disappeared down the street. Back home, Miguel settled into the worn armchair in his office corner. The dogs lay scattered around him on the floor, their breathing steady and calm. Hope rested her golden head on his knee while he opened the first book. Chapter 1. Understanding Your Blind Dog's World, Miguel read aloud, his voice gentle and measured. Faith's ears twitched at the sound of his voice. Valor scooted closer to the chair. As Miguel continued reading, making mental notes about tactile markers and verbal cues, he felt Joy lean against his leg. Grace had curled up next to her siblings, all of them settling into the rhythm of his voice. He paused between chapters, looking down at the peaceful faces of his dogs. Their trust in him was growing, shown in small ways. A wagging tail here, a gentle nuzzle there. Miguel ran his hand over Hope's soft head, determination building as he absorbed the information from the books. "We're going to figure this out together," he murmured, turning to the next chapter. The afternoon light softened as he read on, his quiet voice filling the room with promise. The morning dew sparkled on the grass as Miguel led his 5 golden retrievers into the backyard. Hope's tail wagged hesitantly as she sniffed the air, while Grace stayed close to Miguel's leg. The wooden ramps he'd built stretched across the yard, like bridges to a new beginning. "Come on, guys," Miguel said softly, pulling treats from his pocket. "Let's try this again." He rattled the treat bag, watching as their ears perked up. Holding a treat near Hope's nose, he guided her toward the nearest ramp. Her paws found the wooden surface, and she inched forward carefully. "That's it, good girl," Miguel encouraged. Valor followed next, but halfway up the ramp, he lost his balance. The dog tumbled sideways with a yelp, landing in the wet grass. Miguel rushed to his side, heart racing. "It's okay, buddy," he soothed, running his hands over Valor to check for injuries. The dog trembled beneath his touch. "You're all right. We'll make some adjustments." Miguel spent the next hour adding grip strips to the ramps and widening the sides. Each small step forward earned praise and treats, even when Faith only managed 2 steps before turning back. At the diner later that day, Miguel sat in a worn vinyl booth, his notebook open before him. The smell of coffee and bacon filled the air as he wrote, "Valor needs extra support on left side. Hope, showing progress with sound cues. Still wasting time on those mutts?" Brian Davis's voice cut through the quiet. He sat 2 tables away, stirring his coffee with obvious disdain. Miguel's pen paused mid-sentence, but he didn't look up. "Those dogs are nothing but trouble," Brian continued. "You're throwing away your time and money on hopeless cases." "That's enough, Brian." Elise's voice rang clear from behind the counter. She stood with her hands on her hips, eyes flashing. "He's doing more good than you ever will." The diner fell silent. Miguel's jaw tightened, but he kept writing, his knuckles white around his pen. That evening, Miguel slumped on his living room couch, exhaustion seeping into his bones. His temples throbbed as he massaged them, doubt creeping in like shadows at dusk. The day's challenges felt heavier than the wood he'd carried for the ramps. A cold nose touched his hand. Joy had sensed his distress, followed quickly by the others. They pressed against him, their warmth and presence steady and sure. Faith rested her head on his knee while Grace leaned into his side. Miguel ran his fingers through their soft fur. "We're not giving up," he whispered, "no matter what." Miguel was checking the mail when he heard footsteps scuffing against the concrete. Lucas Miller stood at the edge of the driveway, hands shoved deep in his pockets, looking everywhere but at Miguel. "Hey," Lucas mumbled, kicking at a pebble. "I was wondering, maybe you could use some help. With the dogs and stuff?" Miguel paused, studying the teenager's face. The usual mockery was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like hope. Before he could answer, Elise Carter walked by, carrying her grocery bags. She caught Miguel's eye and gave a small, encouraging nod. "All right," Miguel said carefully. "You can help me fill their water bowls." In the backyard, the morning sun warmed the wooden ramps Miguel had built. Lucas stood awkwardly until Miguel handed him a leash. "This is Joy," Miguel explained. Just guide her gently along the ramp. Let her set the pace. Lucas's first attempt was clumsy. He pulled too hard, making Joy whimper. But then something changed in his face. He knelt down, speaking softly to the golden retriever. "Sorry, girl. Let's try again, okay?" Miguel watched in surprise as Lucas guided Joy with unexpected tenderness. The dog's tail began to wag. She followed Lucas's gentle encouragement up the ramp. "That's it," Lucas whispered. "You've got this." Later, in Miguel's small kitchen, the quiet was comfortable rather than awkward. Miguel made them both sandwiches while the dogs dozed nearby. Lucas picked at the crust of his bread, then spoke so quietly, Miguel almost missed it. "My mom loved dogs," he said, his voice catching slightly. "She used to volunteer at the shelter before she got sick." Miguel just nodded, giving Lucas the space to continue if he wanted to. Faith padded over and rested her head on Lucas's knee. The boy's hand automatically went to scratch behind her ears, just like his mother might have done. Miguel woke to the sound of whimpering. Faith, usually the most energetic of his blind dogs, lay curled in her bed while the others wandered around for breakfast. His heart squeezed with worry as he knelt beside her. "What's wrong, girl?" he whispered, running gentle hands over her fur. Faith barely lifted her head, her nose warm and dry. When he placed her food bowl nearby, she turned away with a soft whine. The other dogs, Hope, Grace, Valor, and Joy, bumped against his legs as he pulled out his phone. His fingers trembled slightly as he dialed the vet's number. At the clinic, the sterile smell made Faith press closer to Miguel's leg. The veterinarian, Dr. Martinez, carefully examined her, speaking in soft, professional tones. "It looks like an infection," she explained, checking Faith's temperature. "We'll need to start her on antibiotics right away." Miguel nodded, his throat tight. "Whatever she needs." When the receptionist handed him the bill, Miguel's stomach dropped. The amount would eat up most of his savings, but he pulled out his credit card without hesitation. Faith's tail wagged weakly as he helped her to the car. Back home, Miguel sat at his desk, surrounded by bills and receipts. The numbers didn't add up. Food for 5 dogs, the new medications, upcoming vaccinations, and his regular expenses. His carpentry work barely covered the basics. Faith rested her head on his knee while the other dogs dozed nearby. Miguel ran his fingers through her soft fur, his voice barely above a whisper. "We'll find a way. I promised you that." The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across his makeshift office as he began circling job listings in the local paper, determination setting his jaw. Each gentle breath from his sleeping dogs reminded him why it was all worth it. The morning sun cast long shadows as Miguel guided his 5 blind dogs along the neighborhood street. Their paws moved with growing confidence on the portable wooden ramps he'd built for curbs and steps. Still, neighbors paused to stare, some shaking their heads. Elise Carter hurried over, her face bright with an idea. "Miguel, I've been thinking. You're so good with your hands. Why not offer carpentry lessons? Or maybe tutoring? It could help with the vet bills." Before Miguel could respond, Brian Davis' sharp voice cut through the air. "Doesn't matter how hard you work. Rules are rules." He stood on his porch, arms crossed, a smirk on his face. Miguel kept his eyes on his dogs, focusing on Elise's kind suggestion rather than Brian's jab. "That's actually a good idea, Elise. Thank you." Later that morning, Miguel stood in the dusty lumber yard watching workers stack fresh planks of pine. The foreman, a weathered man named Pete, listened as Miguel explained his situation. "I can work around my schedule with the dogs," Miguel said. "Any small projects you need help with? I'm your man." The foreman nodded, impressed by the determination in Miguel's voice. "We could use an extra hand with some custom orders. Your work on those dog ramps shows promise." From behind a stack of lumber, Lucas Miller watched the exchange, his usual scowl softening as he observed Miguel's quiet persistence. As dusk painted the sky in soft oranges, Miguel worked with his dogs in the backyard. The ramps creaked softly under their paws as they practiced. "Good girl, Joy. That's it, Valor," he encouraged, offering treats for each successful attempt. Hope, sensing his location, playfully bumped his knee with her nose. Miguel couldn't help but smile, a rare, genuine expression that lit up his tired face. He sat on the bottom step of his back porch, surrounded by his furry family, feeling a flutter of hope, despite the mountain of challenges ahead. In Miguel's living room, the morning light filtered through thin curtains as he knelt beside Hope, one of his blind golden retrievers. Small cotton balls dabbed with lavender marked the corner of the couch, while peppermint indicated doorways. Miguel guided Hope's nose toward the lavender scent. "That's it, girl. Remember, this smell means furniture." His voice remained gentle as Hope bumped into the coffee table instead. The other dogs, Grace, Valor, Joy, and Faith, waited their turn, tails wagging at the sound of his voice. After an hour of patient work, Joy successfully navigated around the couch without collision. Miguel's face lit up as he offered her a treat. "Good girl." The other dogs began picking up on the scents too, their movements becoming less hesitant. Later that morning, Miguel stood at the street corner, checking his phone for carpentry job listings. Lucas Miller approached, hands stuffed in his pockets. "Hey," Lucas said, scuffing his shoe against the sidewalk. "I could help you out sometimes. You know, with the dogs and stuff." Before Miguel could respond, Brian Davis walked by, his expensive leather shoes clicking against the pavement. "What's the point of pitying those dogs? They'll never be normal." Lucas spun around, his face flushing red. "You're just a heartless jerk. At least he's trying to help someone besides himself." Brian's mouth dropped open in surprise, but he quickly recovered with a scowl and walked away. "Thank you, Lucas," Miguel said quietly. That evening, Miguel and Lucas sat at the kitchen table, sharing a simple meal of spaghetti. The dogs lay scattered around them, content and drowsy. Lucas pushed his food around his plate. "My mom died 3 months ago," Lucas said suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Cancer." Miguel set down his fork, giving Lucas his full attention. "Dad, he just works all the time now. Barely talks to me." Lucas' shoulders hunched. "Sometimes I come home and he's already gone to bed. Or maybe he never came home at all." Miguel nodded, understanding in his eyes. "That must be very hard." "The way you are with the dogs." Lucas glanced at Faith, who had rested her head on his knee. "It reminds me of how Mom used to be. Always patient, always kind." Miguel reached across the table and squeezed Lucas's shoulder, offering silent support as the teenager wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. The morning crowd at the town diner buzzed with conversation and the clinking of coffee cups. Elise Carter sat in her usual booth, absently stirring her coffee while reviewing paperwork from the library. Brian Davis's loud voice cut through the ambient noise from 2 booths over. "Those dogs are a nuisance," Brian declared to another businessman. "The zoning laws are clear, no more than 3 pets per household. Plus, running what amounts to a shelter in a residential area? That's against code." Elise's hand froze mid-stir. Her heart sank as Brian continued. "I've already spoken to the council. It's just a matter of time before we serve the eviction notice." Later that afternoon, Elise hurried to Miguel's house. She found him in the backyard, working with the dogs on their ramp exercises. The golden fur of all 5 retrievers gleamed in the late sun as they carefully navigated the wooden structures. "Miguel," she called out softly, not wanting to startle the dogs, "I need to talk to you." He turned, wiping sweat from his brow. "What's wrong?" Elise wrung her hands. I overheard Brian at the diner this morning. He's planning to have you evicted. Something about zoning laws and too many dogs. Miguel's jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady. I wondered when he'd try something like this. What will you do? Whatever it takes to protect them. Miguel knelt to scratch behind Joy's ears. These dogs depend on me. I won't abandon them. The community might help, Elise offered. I know several people at the library who think what you're doing is wonderful. We could gather support, maybe petition the council. Thank you, Elise. That means a lot. As twilight painted the sky in deep purples, Miguel worked alone in his tool shed. The 5 dogs lay scattered around him, their breathing steady and peaceful. Wood shavings covered the floor as he carefully carved letters into a large wooden board. Sanchez Family Home, followed by smaller letters spelling out hope, grace, valor, joy, and faith. His chisel moved steadily, each stroke deliberate and determined. The dogs' heads lifted occasionally at the sound of the carving, but they remained calm, trusting in Miguel's presence. The fresh scent of cedar filled the shed as Miguel worked, his quiet resolve evident in every careful movement. The screen door slammed with a violent crack that echoed down the quiet suburban street. Elise Carter stood frozen on her front porch as her husband stormed past her, wheeling a large suitcase behind him. "I'm done," he shouted, not looking back. "Done with your constant nagging. Done with this whole mess." Through the window, their children's small faces peered out, eyes wide and frightened. Elise's hands trembled as she wrapped her arms around herself, tears starting to fall. Lucas Miller, who had been walking home from Miguel's house, stopped in his tracks at the scene unfolding before him. He watched as Elise's husband threw the suitcase into his truck and sped away, tires screeching against the pavement. Elise crumpled onto the porch steps, her shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. Later that evening, Lucas paced nervously in Miguel's living room, the blind dogs following the sound of his footsteps. "I've never seen Mrs. Carter like that," Lucas said, his voice tight with concern. "She was just crying, right there on her porch." Miguel stopped arranging the dogs' feeding bowls, his brow furrowed. Hope nudged his hand, sensing his tension, while Faith pressed against his leg. The other dogs gathered close, creating a protective circle around him. "Should we do something?" Lucas asked, watching Miguel's internal struggle play out on his face. Miguel ran a hand through his hair, pacing the length of the living room. The dogs tracked his movement, their heads turning in unison. Finally, he stopped and nodded. "Wait here with the dogs," he said softly. "I'll be back soon." In his small kitchen, Miguel quickly gathered ingredients and mixed a batch of simple sugar cookies. Nothing fancy, but made with care. As they baked, he thought about how Elise had defended him at the diner, how she'd offered help when others only showed scorn. The sky had turned a deep purple when Miguel climbed Elise's porch steps, holding a basket of still warm cookies. He found her sitting in a wooden rocking chair, staring into the gathering darkness. "Elise," he said quietly. She turned, quickly wiping her eyes. "Miguel, what are you doing here?" "I brought these," he said, holding out the basket. "And I wanted to make sure you're okay." Elise's composure cracked, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "I don't know what I'm going to do," she whispered. "Everything's falling apart, and I feel so alone." Miguel set the basket down and sat in the chair next to her. They sat in companionable silence as crickets began their evening song, sharing the simple comfort of being understood. The morning sun beat down on Miguel's back as he carefully measured and cut wooden boards for the storefront repair. Sweat dripped from his forehead as he worked, each precise movement bringing him closer to earning the money he desperately needed for the dog's care. "Looking good, Sanchez," the foreman called out, inspecting Miguel's progress. "Clean work as always." The rhythmic sound of hammering filled the air until a familiar voice cut through the noise. "Well, if it isn't our local dog whisperer." Miguel's shoulders tensed as Brian Davis approached, dressed in an expensive suit that seemed out of place among the sawdust and tools. "Mr. Davis," the foreman greeted. "Here to check on the renovations?" Brian barely acknowledged the foreman, his eyes fixed on Miguel. "I hear those blind mutts of yours have been keeping the whole block up at night. Quite the nuisance, wouldn't you say?" Miguel's jaw tightened, but his hands remained steady as he continued working. "They're adjusting well, sir. Getting better every day." "We'll see about that," Brian muttered, loud enough for Miguel to hear. After finishing his shift, worry gnawed at Miguel's stomach as he headed to the town hall. The records clerk, a thin woman with wire-rimmed glasses, typed into her computer as Miguel waited. "Ah, yes, 247 Oak Street," she said, adjusting her glasses. "There was a recent change in ownership, actually. The property was purchased last week by—" She squinted at the screen. "A Brian Davis." Miguel's heart sank. The room seemed to spin as the clerk's words echoed in his head. His home, the safe haven he'd created for the dogs, was now in the hands of the one person who seemed determined to destroy everything he'd built. That evening, Miguel sat in his dimly lit living room, his head buried in his hands. The weight of the day pressed down on him like a physical force. Hope, grace, valor, joy, and faith sensed his distress, padding quietly across the floor to surround him. Their warm bodies pressed against his legs, offering silent comfort. "What are we going to do?" Miguel whispered, reaching down to stroke Faith's soft fur. The dog nuzzled his hand, and Miguel felt a surge of determination through his exhaustion. "We'll fight this together. I won't let him win." The dogs huddled closer, their steady breathing filling the quiet room with a reminder of why he couldn't give up. Elise's kitchen was warm and inviting in the early morning light. She poured 2 cups of coffee while Miguel sat at her small wooden table, his hands wrapped around the steaming mug. "Brian Davis bought my property," Miguel said quietly. "He'll probably try to evict me and the dogs." Elise's eyes widened. She set her coffee down and leaned forward. "Miguel, we can't let that happen. The community needs to know about this." "What can they do?" Miguel's voice was heavy with worry. "More than you think. We could start a petition, show Brian that people support what you're doing." Elise's voice grew stronger. "These dogs aren't just animals anymore. They're part of our town's story." Miguel looked up, touched by her conviction. "Thank you, Elise. Just thank you." Later that afternoon, Miguel was walking home when Lucas appeared at the street corner, hands stuffed in his pockets, but determination written across his young face. "I heard about Brian," Lucas said. "I want to help. I can get other kids from school to support you." Miguel stopped, surprised by the offer. "You'd do that?" "These dogs—" Lucas paused, searching for words. "They showed me that broken things aren't worthless, that sometimes the ones everyone gives up on are the ones worth fighting for." Miguel nodded, understanding exactly what Lucas meant. "That means a lot, Lucas, really." That night, Miguel sat in his backyard watching his 5 golden retrievers sleeping peacefully on their blankets. Hope's tail twitched in her sleep, while Faith snored softly against Grace's side. Valor and Joy were curled together, their breathing steady and calm. The night sky stretched endlessly above them, stars twinkling like distant promises. Miguel felt a deep sense of peace wash over him, despite everything. Looking at his sleeping dogs, he knew in his heart that he would never give up on them. They had given him purpose, and now he would make sure they always had a home. The community center buzzed with whispers as Miguel stood at the front of the room. Fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the faces of his neighbors, some curious, others openly skeptical. Elise stood beside him, her presence steady and reassuring. "I know many of you think I'm foolish," Miguel began, his voice soft but clear. "But these dogs deserve a chance at a good life. They're making progress every day." Laughter erupted from the back of the room. Someone called out, "They're just blind dogs." Miguel's shoulders tensed, but he continued, "They're more than that. They're teaching us all about courage and—" "This is ridiculous!" another voice interrupted. Suddenly, Lucas stepped forward from the crowd. His face was flushed, but his voice rang strong. "You're all wrong about Miguel and the dogs." The room fell silent, surprised by the usually troublesome teen's outburst. "I've seen what he does," Lucas continued, his hands shaking slightly. "He spends every moment helping these dogs learn to live again. They're not useless, they're brave. And Miguel?" Lucas turned to face the crowd. "He's the only person in this town who gave me a chance when everyone else had written me off." From the back of the room, Brian Davis rolled his eyes dramatically, but several neighbors shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Later, in the alley behind the community center, Miguel and Lucas stood in the growing dusk. The brick walls echoed their quiet voices. "Thank you, Lucas," Miguel said softly. "What you did in there—" Lucas kicked at a loose stone. "I meant every word. Those dogs." He paused, struggling to find the right words. "Watching them try so hard, never giving up, it made me think about my own life differently. They taught me that being different doesn't mean being worthless." Miguel placed a gentle hand on Lucas's shoulder. The boy who had once mocked him was gone, replaced by someone stronger and kinder. Back home, Miguel sat in his living room, the events of the day weighing heavily on his mind. A soft scratching sound caught his attention. Valor, one of his golden retrievers, was moving confidently through the room, navigating around furniture without a single collision. Miguel's breath caught in his throat. He watched in amazement as Valor made his way to the water bowl, then back to his favorite spot near the window, never once bumping into anything. Tears welled in Miguel's eyes as he watched this small but significant victory. This was why he couldn't give up. This was what he was fighting for. Inside his workshop, Miguel ran his calloused hands over the smooth wooden toys he'd crafted. Small bells jingled softly as he tested each one, ensuring they'd help guide his dogs through their daily routines. Sawdust covered his worn jeans, evidence of hours spent working despite his dwindling savings. "Not perfect," he muttered, adjusting a loose bell on one of the markers, "but it'll work." The morning light filtered through the workshop windows, catching dust motes in its beams. Miguel lined up the finished pieces, tactile markers for doorways, toys with different textures, and guideposts for the yard. Each item represented hours of careful work and problem-solving. His wallet might be getting thinner, but pride swelled in his chest at what he'd accomplished with simple materials and determination. In the town square at midday, sunlight bounced off store windows as Elise confronted Brian outside the county office. Her voice was steady but pleading. "Brian, please reconsider. These dogs are helping people. They're bringing out the best in Lucas. They're giving Miguel purpose." Brian's face hardened. "Rules are rules, Elise. This isn't about feelings." "It's about basic human kindness," she pressed. "It's about property values and zoning laws," Brian snapped, waving a stack of papers. "And I'm filing this complaint today." Miguel stood frozen nearby, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Every muscle in his body urged him to speak up, to fight back. Instead, he took slow, deep breaths, letting Brian's words wash over him without response. His silence spoke volumes. As twilight painted the sky in soft purples and oranges, Miguel sat cross-legged in his backyard. Hope rested her head on his knee, while Faith and Grace lay nearby, their breathing steady and peaceful. Joy and Valor explored the yard with growing confidence, following the scent trails he'd created. The neighborhood stretched out before him, houses casting long shadows in the fading light. Miguel scratched behind Hope's ears, drawing strength from the simple trust these animals placed in him. Their presence anchored him, helping him push aside the worry about Brian's complaint. A cool breeze rustled through the trees, carrying the sounds of distant traffic and children playing. Miguel watched his dogs navigate their space with increasing sureness, each small victory a reminder of why he couldn't give up now. At the Sunset Motel, Pablo Sanchez sat on the edge of a creaky bed, his duffel bag still unpacked beside him. The neon sign outside cast a red glow through thin curtains, matching the uncertainty burning in his chest. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through local social media posts about his brother Miguel and his blind dogs. "What are you doing, hermano?" he whispered, shaking his head. The stories he'd heard seemed impossible. Miguel, always the quiet one, now standing up to the whole town over 5 disabled dogs. Pablo ran his hands through his salt and pepper hair, memories of their last argument still fresh after all these years. The next morning, sunlight streamed through Miguel's kitchen window as Elise Carter unpacked grocery bags filled with dog treats and supplies. The 5 golden retrievers lounged nearby, their ears perking up at the rustle of packages. "I saw someone in town yesterday," Elise said carefully, placing a bag of kibble on the counter. "Your brother Pablo." Miguel's hands froze mid-task. The muscles in his jaw tightened as he absorbed the news. "He's staying at the Sunset Motel," Elise continued gently. "Maybe he's here to help?" Miguel shook his head, his voice quiet but strained. "Pablo doesn't help anyone unless there's something in it for him." "People can change," Elise suggested, touching his arm lightly. "Look at how Lucas has transformed. Maybe Pablo's presence is a chance to heal old wounds." Miguel turned to watch his dogs, finding comfort in their peaceful presence. "Some wounds run too deep, Elise." Later that afternoon, Miguel sat on his front porch, attempting to read a dog training manual, but distracted by thoughts of his brother. The dogs rested at his feet when heavy footsteps approached. Looking up, he saw Pablo standing at the bottom of the porch steps, hands thrust deep in his jacket pockets. The dogs raised their heads, letting out soft warning barks. Miguel's heart hammered in his chest as he slowly stood. "Miguel," Pablo said, his voice rough with emotion. "Pablo," Miguel responded, gripping the porch railing. "It's been a long time." The brothers stared at each other, years of unspoken words hanging in the air between them. The dogs moved closer to Miguel, sensing his tension, their presence both a comfort and a shield. The living room felt smaller with Pablo sitting across from Miguel, the weight of unspoken words filling the space between them. The blind dogs lounged on their blankets, surprisingly calm despite the stranger's presence. Hope's tail thumped softly against the floor, creating a gentle rhythm in the silence. "Miguel," Pablo started, his voice rough with emotion. "I was wrong. About everything." He clasped his hands together, looking down at the worn carpet. "The way I acted after Mama died, fighting over the house, telling you to grow up and get a real job." He swallowed hard. "I'm sorry." Miguel stroked Valor's head, drawing strength from the dog's steady presence. The familiar texture of golden fur under his fingers helped ground him as memories of heated arguments and slammed doors echoed in his mind. "I should have supported you," Pablo continued. "Instead, I let my pride get in the way." Faith padded over to Pablo, surprising both brothers by resting her head on his knee. Pablo's hand trembled slightly as he patted her. The next morning, dew still sparkled on the grass as Miguel and Pablo walked side by side down the quiet sidewalk. The early sun cast long shadows ahead of them. "So this Brian Davis," Pablo said, "he bought your rental property just to force you out?" Miguel nodded. "He thinks the dogs are a nuisance, says they'll bring down property values." "And you're fighting him?" "The Miguel I remember would have packed up and left town." That Miguel didn't have anyone depending on him. They passed the spot where the dogs had first stumbled on their way home from the shelter. "These dogs, they've taught me more about courage than I ever knew." Pablo watched his brother's face, seeing determination where there used to be uncertainty. "You've changed, hermano." Later, sitting at Miguel's small kitchen table, steam rising from coffee cups between them, Pablo pulled out his checkbook. "Let me help," he said. "Whatever you need for lawyers, repairs, anything." The dogs lay in a loose circle around the table, their presence a silent blessing on the brothers' reconciliation. "And I'll testify about your character," Pablo added. "Tell them about how you always took care of Mama's dogs, even when you were just a kid." Miguel's throat tightened. He reached across the table and gripped his brother's hand, words unnecessary between them as morning light filled the kitchen with warmth. The town hall buzzed with tension as Brian Davis stood at the podium, his voice sharp with authority. "These animals are a liability," he declared, shuffling his papers. "The zoning laws are clear about the number of pets allowed, not to mention the safety concerns of having 5 blind dogs in a residential area." Miguel sat quietly, Pablo and Elise flanking him like protective shadows. When his turn came, Miguel approached the podium with steady steps. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as he faced the council. "These dogs were considered worthless by many," Miguel began, his voice soft but clear. "But they've shown me what real strength looks like. Every day they overcome challenges without complaint. They've taught me about patience, about trust." He paused, looking around the room. "And they've brought people together in ways I never expected." Lucas Miller stood up from his seat, his teenage awkwardness forgotten as he spoke. "I used to think Mr. Sanchez was crazy," he admitted, cheeks flushing. "But watching him with those dogs, it changed me. They showed me that everybody deserves a chance, even when things seem impossible." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Several neighbors who had once laughed at Miguel now sat thoughtfully, their expressions softening. In the hallway afterward, the group gathered near a window where afternoon light streamed in. Pablo gripped Miguel's shoulder firmly. "No matter what, you've already proven who you are," he said, pride evident in his voice. Elise stepped forward, her eyes bright. "Thank you, Miguel," she said softly. "You've shown us all what real courage looks like." Lucas stood nearby, practically glowing with the satisfaction of being part of something bigger than himself. Back home that evening, Miguel sat in his familiar spot on the living room floor. Hope curled against his left side, while Grace and Faith settled near his feet. Valor and joy completed the circle, their steady breathing a comfort in the quiet room. As they waited for the council's decision, Miguel ran his fingers through soft golden fur. "We've come this far," he whispered to his faithful companions. "We won't stop now." The morning sun cast long shadows across the quiet neighborhood street as Elise Carter approached Miguel's house, holding a brown paper bag that filled the air with the sweet scent of fresh pastries. Miguel was outside, adjusting one of the guide ropes he'd set up for the dogs. "I thought you could use something warm this morning," Elise said, offering him the bag with a gentle smile. Miguel accepted it gratefully. "Thank you. How are you holding up?" Elise's eyes welled with tears. "He's gone for good this time. Signed the papers yesterday." She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to hold it together. "But watching you face everything with such grace, it gives me hope, Miguel. You don't back down, even when things get tough. Miguel nodded, understanding in his eyes. Sometimes the hardest paths lead us where we need to be. They stood in comfortable silence, two souls finding strength in shared struggles. Later that morning, Lucas arrived in Miguel's backyard, eager to help with the dog's training. Miguel had set up a simple obstacle course with wooden platforms and gentle slopes. Remember, Miguel instructed, gentle encouragement and lots of praise. Lucas nodded, taking the leash for joy. He guided her carefully, speaking softly. That's it, girl. Small steps. The other dogs waited their turn, tails wagging at the sound of treats being given. When it was Faith's turn, something remarkable happened. She navigated the entire course without a single misstep, her confidence growing with each section. Did you see that? Lucas exclaimed, his face lighting up. She did it perfectly. Miguel beamed with pride, kneeling to scratch behind Faith's ears. Good girl, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. The breakthrough meant more than just physical progress. It was proof that patience and belief could work miracles. As afternoon settled in, Pablo visited Miguel's living room. The dogs had grown comfortable with his presence, no longer barking when he entered. He sat across from his brother, his expression serious but kind. I've made arrangements, Pablo said, just in case things don't go our way with the council. There's a place about 20 minutes from here, plenty of space for the dogs, and it's yours as long as you need it. Miguel looked at his brother, touched by the gesture. Pablo, We're family, Pablo interrupted, reaching out to squeeze Miguel's shoulder. I should have remembered that sooner. The dog settled around them, sensing the warmth between the brothers. Hope, the smallest of the five, rested her head on Pablo's knee, drawing a smile from both men. Remember when we were kids, Pablo said softly, and Dad always said family stands together? Miguel nodded, feeling the weight of years of misunderstanding beginning to lift. We're standing together now. That's what matters. The town hall buzzed with nervous energy as Miguel sat between Pablo and Elise, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. The 5 blind golden retrievers' future hung in the balance as the council members shuffled their papers. After careful consideration, the town clerk announced, her voice steady and clear, the council has decided that Mr. Sanchez may keep the dogs, provided he follows specific guidelines for their care and safety. A wave of relief washed over Miguel's face. Behind him, Lucas broke into a wide grin. The clerk continued, these guidelines include proper fencing, regular veterinary checkups, and maintaining the current safety modifications to the property. Brian Davis's face reddened as he sat rigid in his chair, jaw clenched. His fingers drummed against his knee in barely contained frustration. Miguel stood, his voice thick with emotion. Thank you. These dogs have brought so much meaning to my life, and I promise to continue providing them the best care possible. Several neighbors nodded approvingly, some even offering small smiles. The atmosphere in the room had shifted dramatically from the tension of previous weeks. Outside the town hall, the afternoon sun warmed their faces as Elise threw her arms around Miguel, tears streaming down her cheeks. You did it, she exclaimed, squeezing him tight. Lucas bounced on his heels, practically glowing with excitement. I knew we could do it. I knew it. Pablo placed a firm hand on his brother's shoulder, a proud smile playing at his lips. The years of distance between them seemed to fade in that moment of triumph. Brian Davis pushed past them, his face dark with anger. This isn't over, he muttered, but his words carried no real threat now. They watched as he stormed off toward his car, shoulders hunched in defeat. As dust settled over the neighborhood, Miguel sat on his porch, surrounded by his beloved dogs. Hope and Grace rested their heads on his knees, while Valor, Joy, and Faith sprawled contentedly at his feet. Their tails wagged lazily in the evening air. Miguel ran his fingers through Hope's soft fur, watching as the last rays of sunlight painted the sky in gentle pinks and purples. The peace he felt in this moment made all the struggles worthwhile. His dogs were safe, and they were home. The early morning sun cast long shadows across the sidewalk as Miguel guided his 5 golden retrievers on their daily walk. Hope led the pack, her nose confidently following the scent markers they'd practiced with for months. The other dogs, Grace, Valor, Joy, and Faith, moved with growing assurance, their paws finding familiar ground. Mrs. Henderson, who once whispered behind her curtains, now stood on her porch with a gentle smile. "Good morning, Miguel," she called softly, careful not to startle the dogs. "Morning," Miguel replied, his chest warming at the simple greeting. Other neighbors emerged for their own morning routines. Instead of pointing or laughing, they offered quiet nods of respect. Mr. Thompson even paused his gardening to watch the dogs navigate around a tree, their movements careful but increasingly confident. Later that morning, Miguel found himself in Elise's front yard, where spring flowers were beginning to bloom. She sat on her porch steps, looking more peaceful than he'd seen her in weeks. "You know," Elise said, her voice steady, "watching you stand up for what you believed in, it helped me find my own strength." She smiled, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "I've enrolled in some classes at the community college, starting fresh." Lucas, who had been helping Elise with her garden, stood up and brushed dirt from his knees. "My dad and I are talking again," he admitted, looking down at his hands. "Really talking. And I'm pulling my grades up at school." He glanced at Miguel. "Seeing you with the dogs, it showed me what patience really means." The afternoon sun was warm as Miguel and Pablo stood in the backyard watching the dogs navigate the obstacle course Miguel had built. Faith confidently climbed the gentle slope of a ramp while Joy waited her turn. "I can't believe you built all this yourself," Pablo said, running his hand along the smooth wood of a platform. "You always were good with your hands, but this—" He shook his head in admiration. Miguel chuckled as Valor playfully bumped against Pablo's leg. "Remember when we used to fight over Dad's old toolbox?" Pablo laughed, a rich, genuine sound that erased years of tension. "And now look at you, building a whole world for these dogs." The brothers watched as Grace and Hope chased each other around the yard, their movements sure and happy, no longer bound by their blindness, but freed by their trust in Miguel and themselves. The evening light filtered through Miguel's living room windows, casting a warm glow across the hardwood floors. He sat in his favorite armchair, absorbed in a carpentry magazine, while his 5 golden retrievers moved around the room with surprising grace. Hope nudged open the kitchen door with her nose, while Valor and Grace played a gentle game of follow the leader between the coffee table and couch. Miguel lowered his magazine, watching in quiet amazement as Joy and Faith navigated perfectly around a floor lamp they'd once feared. No more bumping into furniture, no more whimpers of confusion, just the soft padding of confident paws and occasional happy snuffles. At the town diner the next day, the lunch crowd buzzed with cheerful conversation. Miguel sat in a booth with Elise and Lucas, sharing a plate of French fries. Lucas had just finished telling a story about his latest school project, making them all laugh. "I got an A+ on it," Lucas said, grinning proudly. "First one this year." "You've worked hard for it," Miguel replied, his eyes crinkling with genuine pride. From his corner table, Brian Davis pushed his coffee cup in slow circles, watching their easy camaraderie. His face showed a mix of emotions, regret, perhaps, or loneliness. The laughter from their table seemed to make his isolation more pronounced. Elise noticed Brian's expression and lowered her voice. He looks different nowadays. Less angry. Everyone deserves a chance to change, Miguel said quietly, remembering his own journey. Outside the diner, later that afternoon, they stood in the mild sunshine. Lucas practically bounced with excitement as he pulled a test paper from his backpack. "Look at this," he beamed. "My math teacher says if I keep this up, I could make honor roll next semester." "That's wonderful, Lucas," Elise said warmly. Lucas tucked the paper away, his expression growing serious. "You know, Miguel, watching you with those dogs, it made me realize I could do better, be better." Elise touched Miguel's arm gently. "You showed all of us what real courage looks like," she said softly. "Standing up for what's right, even when everyone doubts you. I needed that reminder more than you know." Miguel ducked his head, humbled by their words. The afternoon sun caught the silver threads in his dark hair as he smiled, thinking of how far they'd all come together. The morning sun painted Miguel's backyard in gentle strokes of gold. Pablo arrived first, carefully balancing a thermos of fresh coffee and a stack of mismatched mugs. "Thought we could all use a good brew," he said, setting everything down on the worn picnic table. Elise followed shortly after, the aroma of freshly baked bread trailing behind her. "Still warm," she smiled, unwrapping the loaf. Hope's nose twitched at the scent, and she patted over cautiously, tail wagging. Lucas bounded in last, clutching a piece of paper to his chest. "I made something," he announced, his usual teenage awkwardness giving way to excitement. He carefully unfolded a detailed pencil drawing of all 5 dogs, each one's unique personality captured in careful strokes. "Lucas, this is beautiful," Miguel said softly, studying the artwork. The teenager ducked his head, pleased. The dogs moved easily among their guests, their confidence evident in every step. Valor gently bumped against Pablo's leg, while Grace and Faith investigated the picnic table. Joy settled near Elise's feet, content to be close to the gathering. "They've come so far," Elise observed, breaking off a piece of bread to share. "Remember when they could barely walk without bumping into everything?" Pablo nodded, pouring coffee for everyone. "My brother's stubbornness finally paid off," he teased, but his voice held pride. From across the fence line, Brian Davis stood in his yard, watching the scene unfold. His usual scowl had softened, replaced by something more complex. He observed the easy laughter, the gentle interactions, the clear bonds that had formed. The dogs moved with grace and confidence, far from the useless animals he'd once labeled them. Something flickered in Brian's eyes, a hint of longing, perhaps regret, as he watched Miguel's small family share their morning together. The happiness he witnessed seemed to affect him deeply, though he remained rooted in his spot, separate from the joy before him. As evening approached and the sun began its descent, Miguel settled onto his porch steps. The day's warmth lingered in the wooden boards beneath him. One by one, the dogs gathered around, their presence as natural as breathing. "Hope," he whispered, scratching behind her ears. "Grace." His hand found each furry head. "Valor, Joy, Faith." Each name carried the weight of their shared journey, spoken like a prayer of thanksgiving. The setting sun painted the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, casting long shadows across the porch. Miguel sat quietly with his dogs, their transformation from scared, struggling creatures to confident, loving companions complete. Each gentle breath, each soft paw step, each trusting lean against his leg, told the story of their victory together. If you enjoyed the story of Miguel, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.